Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is a part of the Resilient Kids and Youth Project. I'm Nathan McKenzie and I'm a part of the Outback Futures team. And with me today is Margot Moody, who's one of our psychologists. Margot, what are we talking about today?
Thanks, Nathan. So today we're talking about 5 ways to help your child prepare for boarding school. So we know lots of our rural families go to boarding school, and it's a topic we often get asked about. It's a big adjustment, no matter how old your child is or how familiar they are with boarding school. And often kids are transitioning to boarding school when they're also navigating puberty, identity changes, important brain development, at the same time of having to adjust to a new school and people and routine. And these things are often hard for any teenager, but our boarding school kids are also having to do it away from their families and support systems. So it's a really big issue for a lot of our rural communities.
It's interesting you brought up the royal family. Their coronation's coming up, isn't it, soon there, Margaret?
Very funny.
No, that's all right. There's a little cat. Fantastic.
Yes.
So big adjustments. What do you find is some of the big adjustments that they need to transition with?
Oh, lots and lots of things. So, like I mentioned, having to go to a new school. So even just getting used to the different way a school might operate, being around lots more kids. So often our boarding school kids are going from very small schools to big schools, not just a few kids in their classroom, but, 20 or so. And even just sort of, the lifestyle changes of getting used to that routine and all those sorts of things. So, for some kids, boarding school will be a completely different world for them.
That's totally fair. I was someone who went to a single school from prep to year 12, so I didn't have that experience to know exactly what it's like in the daunting world. So why do you think it's important to touch on this topic for those parents or families going into boarding school?
So boarding school itself is a very long process for a lot of kids. So there's lots of preparation going in for those lots of years. But those first initial few weeks can be really daunting for both kids and parents. It can be called almost like a bit of an abrupt separation that kids and parents have to get used to.
So abrupt separation, do you want to just go into that? And were you someone who went to boarding school?
Yeah, good question, Nathan. So my mum actually coined the term abrupt separation. So a bit of context, I did go to boarding school for about 7 years. And I had 2 older brothers that also went to boarding school for 6 years. So mum's a bit of a veteran boarding school parent. And she kept a diary of our entire time there and really well documented our journey. So she mentioned it because it's, you can do lots of things to prepare and get used to it and talk about what it's going to be like. But at the end of the day, you go from spending every day with your family and your child to dropping them off at school and, not necessarily seeing them for a few months. So even though you're well prepared and you know what it's going to be like, it's really quite abrupt to sort of be separated from your family like that. In saying that, lots and lots of really great things about boarding school. It's very hard thing to get used to, but I had a great experience. Lots of kids I know have a great experience. You're set up for lots of opportunities well beyond your schooling. You get access to extra subjects and sports and other activities that you might not necessarily get in your hometown. So lots of things to look forward to as well. And by preparing yourself well and setting your child up for particularly those first few tricky weeks, it really sets them up for a really positive boarding school experience in total. Some kids are there for years, so you want them to settle in quite well.
Yeah, and you said 7 years for yourself. So how long distance-wise were your home away from where the boarding school was, like hours to drive or fly or whatever it was? Just give us a bit of a context there.
So I grew up in southwest Queensland. So my first couple of years was in Toowoomba, so about 700 kilometres from my hometown. And then high school for Brisbane, so 900 kilometres away. So very far.
And how did you cope with that yourself initially? Like you talk about like the initial abrupt separation. How did you feel? How did you go? And what are some of the little things that you may have used to help you go, okay, how can I deal with this change in my life?
Yeah, good question. So, in hindsight, I actually didn't think it was that hard, but talking to my mum, I realised I actually did find it quite hard, which was interesting. For me, I always knew I was going to go to boarding school, and having two older brothers go off as well and family friends, it was very normalized. So there was never, anything that came up, anything that was tricky, I knew it was a very normal experience and I just sort of had to get through it. So just sort of having that understanding of what it was going to be like and that it was going to be a bit tricky, but it was all part of the process, and it was almost like a bit of a rite of passage for everyone in my community. So I'd say that's how I got through it.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I was just thinking about, like, for me, and I think you may have already touched on this as well, but because you do know it's coming and that type of stuff, because you live so far away from school, for secondary school and that type of thing, my assumption was that most people in that situation would be talking to the kids from primary school all the way through. Is that something that happened for you guys as well? Is that a common thing, or is that kind of we don't know just yet, and then it just happens? Like, what's that kind of? Can you just unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I imagine it's different for every family. So in my family, we always knew, so we talked about it. Ever since we were really little, we always knew we were going to boarding school. But I also know other families that, maybe they didn't quite know what they were doing and they didn't make the decision until quite later. So it is very different for every family. For some families, boarding school isn't necessarily an option, or, maybe it's an option later on, or they might decide against boarding school and then change their mind. So it is very different for every family, and how they choose to navigate that.
Yeah, and I suppose there is that option of like the school of the air and that type of thing as well. So you can do school at home depending on how your situation comes about as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this webinar is part of the Resilient Kids project. So how does this topic help kids and teens kind of develop their resilience in relationship to leaving home and going to boarding school?
Yeah, so just by attending boarding school, kids are very well situated to build resilience. Just by being there, they sort of have to. They, have to learn how to tackle lots of different tricky situations, peer relationships, managing their schedules and study habits, all those sorts of things, all very independently from their families. We can do lots of preparation and planning to help kids navigate these challenges, but even the most well-prepared kid is probably going to get homesick at some point, or have a fight with their friend or whatnot. So by being resilient, kids will be able to get through these challenges on their own, know when to seek out support if they really need it, and then really bounce back from whatever that challenge is, so they can continue to enjoy boarding school. And it was interesting when I was talking to my parents about this topic, without even mentioning resilience, it was the number one thing they said that kids really needed to learn, or not even needed to, they just did learn, just by being at boarding school.
Yeah, so it's kind of an automatic thing. So you talk about kids there. What about the parents and that disconnection of the kids now leaving the home? How does the resilience of the parents develop, or is it already developed enough to go through that, or is there big adjustments that need to happen within the family dynamics?
It's hard to say. So I think even just by talking to parents who have sent their kids to boarding school, it's not something that you can ever be prepared for or feel resilient for. It's definitely a tricky thing for parents and the whole family, really. And it's something similar to the kids going off to boarding school. The parents have to prepare and adjust and, set themselves up for what it's going to be like. One of our tips later in the webinar is actually how families can prepare themselves. So I won't spoil it too much, but we'll have a few practical tips for parents and families.
Fantastic. Well, that leads straight into it. So what are some practical ways parents can help their kids prepare for boarding school?
So the first thing parents can do is try to be positive, but also acknowledge any worries your child might have. So try to speak quite positive about their boarding school experience. So I've actually mentioned this in a previous webinar, but kids are really good at picking up adults' feelings. So if you're quite anxious about it or nervous, your child might pick up on this and also think, oh, this is something to be anxious or nervous about. So try to be mindful about what you're portraying. That said, if your child does have some worries, don't just try to sweep it under and be positive about it. It's important to address what's going on for them. So think about what worries they have and how they might manage them once they're away. If there are any worries, any questions they have about what school is like, try to find ways to answer that before they go away. So even getting them to talk to, a relative or a sibling or a family friend that's gone to boarding school before to answer any questions they have, if they can talk to the school about what it's going to be like, addressing challenges that they're likely to experience, like homesickness and peer troubles ahead of them going, and also thinking about what strategies they can manage once they're there. Also talk about what they're looking forward to at boarding school. So like I mentioned, it is quite scary, but there's lots of really exciting things. So if they've got some worries about it, but they're also able to think, oh, I might miss mum, but, I get to play rugby or do rowing or something like that. There are also things that can help mitigate against some of those nerves they have.
Yeah, trying to balance it out, I suppose, with the positives and negatives that may be going through their minds. So
absolutely.
That's good. And yeah, just that idea of acknowledging the situation is going to be really good for the child just to settle themselves. And I suppose if the parents have already gone to boarding school as well, then they can just talk about their experience. Would that be a good way of landing it?
Yeah, absolutely. If mum or dad went and they get to talk about what it was like for them, and even the child can think about what it might be different for them, now that it's a few years past, or definitely. And it also really normalizes the experience as well. It's for me, knowing that my brothers went and my dad went before me, it was sort of, it's a family thing to do. So, it can be really helpful bringing family into it.
Yeah, nice. What's another way or any other ideas around that practical skills?
Yep. So another way parents can prepare their kids is to build up life skills. So depending what age or school your child goes to, some kids are going to have a lot of increased responsibility. So it's really helpful to make sure your child is prepared and knows sort of how to look after themselves away from you. So some practical things to keep in mind is things like hygiene. Knowing kids knowing how to look after themselves properly, particularly when they enter puberty. Boys might need to learn to start wearing deodorant and things like that. And wash. Mum's not there to remind you. Things like laundry as well. So most schools have a laundry service, but sometimes it can be helpful for kids to know how to do it themselves if they want to. Even some simple things like making sure their clothes are labelled and knowing when to put clothes in for laundry and that sort of thing. Again, thinking of stinky boys who might not necessarily know, not just boys, but
feeling a bit bashed here. Come on.
Yeah. I went to an all-girls school, so I'm a bit biased. Yeah. Even things like cleanliness. So a lot of schools have, might require their rooms to be clean, make their bed every day, know when to change their sheets and towels. So really things like, that basic life skills that, kids might not learn till later. Unless they go to boarding school. Being mindful of routines and study as well. So often boarding schools have very strict routines about when kids study, when they do different activities, helping your child to study on their own as well. So rather than having someone guide them, because often when they have study periods, they're just by themselves doing homework. So lots of those little nitty-gritty things to just think about. Is your child prepared? Can they handle those sorts of things on their own? And as an aside to that as well, just be mindful of any cultural differences your child might face going from the country to city. We often don't think about those little things, but, even sometimes the language we use is different from kids in the city. I personally found it very tricky learning that smoker was morning tea and got called a country bumpkin a few times because of that. So, just be mindful of those sorts of things.
Yeah. And so I'm kind of hearing a bit of like independent learning and independent living. So you talk about life skills, but I suppose most people in let's say cities, that type of stuff, would be doing this when they're leaving home to go to university or getting jobs, that type of stuff. So everything's kind of landed earlier on in life from my little take home from that. But do you have any stories that relate to how you went through things in this area of learning life skills and being independent?
That's a good question. I'm having to trip down memory lane to answer that one. I guess I was quite lucky. I went when I was quite young, so I still had a lot of support at my boarding school to know when to do certain things. And so that helped me when I went on to high school boarding, and I knew, okay, I learned at my first boarding school to change my sheets every week and that sort of thing.
So it's not, does it have to get told to do that?
Yeah. So, be mindful of how the boarding school sets it up, I guess, to help teach your child those things. Yeah, and I guess it was also helpful having two brothers again, having been before, so I knew what it was like. But yeah, all those little things you don't think about until you're, and especially as kids, they don't think about all those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And even, you know, I mean, I was very fortunate. My mum was very good at diligent and making me clean my room and that type of stuff. And, you know, she'd pay me money if I did some ironing and that type of stuff. So it was nice little incentives to get me cleaning before I left home and
Yeah.
things, which are skills that I've now using, which is fantastic. So
Yeah.
what are some other tips for parents?
So another thing they can do, and it kind of leads into what we were just talking about, is to encourage your child to be independent. So, you know, we're just talking a lot about building up those life skills, and independence is very much one of those. So finding ways for your child to manage away from you and away from home. So things like sleepovers and trips away can be really helpful, even just getting them used to sleeping in a different bed and environment. You know, bonus points if you've got a relative in the city they're staying in, so they get used to all the noise. That's often a bit of a tricky one for kids. Things like decision making and problem solving as well, in terms of learning to do things on their own, can be really important. So, you know, when your child's at boarding school, they won't have you around to remind them to pack their swimmers or their PE kit or, you know, whatever it is they need that day. So if not already, try and get your children to start packing their own bags and lunches for school. So they also find ways to remember themselves. So also really important to let them make those mistakes at home. You know, don't try and help them when they're in those situations, so they learn how to problem solve. They're going to have to do that at boarding school, so they're going to have to get used to it, you know, sooner rather than later. So if they forget their swimmers one day, you know, talk to them about how they might manage that. What are they going to do if they forget their swimmers?
Yeah, so that's walking them through that process instead of being like, yeah, it's your fault, you've done this wrong, like come from their strengths and try and work out how to like encourage them to remember next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know, being very gentle about letting them make those mistakes and figuring it out on their own. Yeah, and giving them space to make those mistakes in an environment where they're able to. You know, it's a bit trickier when they're away from mum and they make those mistakes. So definitely doing it in a really nice, gentle way.
Yeah, no, good. It sounds like your parents may have helped you with that growing up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think. Maybe they did it because there were definitely times at boarding school I forgot my PE kit and my swimmers and had to deal with it. So, definitely part of even that resilience thing we're talking about of, you know, making mistakes and learning how to figure it out on your own and being okay to make mistakes. So, I'm sure my parents did that for me.
Yeah, good. Some great tips there. Just wondering, when you went to boarding school or when kids go in the future, is there certain people at the boarding school they should be kind of targeting to get to know? Like, I mean, I lead on youth camps, so I know that if you go and talk to the kitchen staff, they generally give you more food because you have a good relationship with them. So is there like a way that kids at the boarding school can kind of engage with someone to manage their emotions if they need to, or know their schedule and that type of stuff? Is there anyone there they can kind of talk to?
Yeah, so depending on the school, most schools will have, you know, a boarding house mum or whatever it might be that sort of looks after that pastoral care of the kid.
Yep.
It's usually a bit more intensive in those younger years, and as kids get older, it's less needed. But I'd encourage parents to reach out to the school to find out who that person is and make those connections, let the child know who they are so they can reach out to them if they need support.
Yep.
Kids these days are really lucky. Most schools have a psychologist or a counsellor that they can also go to. So if you think that might be helpful for your child, also reach out and find out who that is and how they might access them. When I went, we didn't have psychs or counsellors in any of the schools. And looking back, I think it probably would have been really handy to know that service was there. So definitely check that out.
Yeah. And do they have like a homework club or anything like that, did you say, or not?
No, I don't think so. But again, every school is different. So, you know, some schools might have extra tutors and things like that for kids that need it. There's always lots of really great support at all different boarding schools for kids who might need extra study help. So again, I encourage parents to check out what's on offer at their school. And if they've got any specific learning needs, you know, if their kids might need extra support with homework, make that known to the school and see how you can organise it.
Yep. Any other practical ways of preparing the family?
Yeah. So the fourth tip I have is to plan ways to stay connected. So having a clear plan in place about how and when you'll stay in touch with your child to help ease any discomfort they might have and you might have about being apart, particularly in those first few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So even getting down to the nitty gritty of saying, you know, you'll call them or they'll call you at a certain time at a certain day. So they know when to expect to hear from you. Really important in those first few weeks, though, to try not to overdo it. So mobile phones are really great, particularly this day and age, in allowing your child to contact you whenever they need you. But you really want to encourage them to figure things out as much as they can on their own to really help build that resilience and that independence, because they can't always get in touch with you. You know, you can't always be there for them. A lot of schools will have some sort of system in place to help with this. So they might say, you know, no phones at certain times or whatever it might be. So my advice would be to try and stick with that as much as parents can. It can be really tricky and, you know, sneaking phones in or whatever it might be. But those systems are there for a reason and they're a really helpful reason. Yeah. My first boarding school I went to, the first week, you know, we didn't have mobile phones, but we couldn't contact our parents for the entire first week. And although that was really tricky, it was really helpful to just settle in and get used to things and not sort of think, I just want to talk to mum about this, so I just need to talk to dad. You know, you start to really quickly learn how to figure things out on your own. So, you know, plan ways to stay connected, but also be mindful of giving children space.
Yeah, fantastic. I used to work in outdoor education and they never used to allow phones there. And it's interesting the amount of community that was developed because the kids had to actually interact face to face. And some kids would bring a guitar and the type of stuff, so they'd play and so that really get that community going. And I'm assuming that that's kind of the same as going to boarding school if you don't have your phones to distract you or continue to jump back onto, that it allows you to build and make friendships sooner than later. And that is that I'm picking up that that's what you felt.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was quite lucky going at a time where no one had mobile phones, so we sort of all had to be there for each other, but it did make it a lot easier to get to know everyone and get used to the system and to make friends, you know, because you weren't distracted by, you know, other communication. You just had to sort of talk to whoever was around you. So it is really good to help make friends and
That's fantastic. So obviously you've moved away from your family, but what about moving away from your local footy club or netball club or, you know, Girl Scouts or whatever it may be, your community? How do you go leaving that and going to boarding school? Is there any connections you held over or anything like that?
Yeah, great question. So kids are often going through a lot of identity development, you know, during those teenage years. So it can be really tricky and confusing for kids who do have that connection or background to their community, you know, their local sports team, whatever it might be. And then to sort of suddenly be apart from that can be really, really hard. So it's important to be mindful of that. And practical things kids can do is to, you know, collect mementos or pictures so they can decorate their room at boarding school.
Yep.
Using social media when appropriate to help them stay connected to whatever's going on at home. Might create a little bit of FOMO for them, but you know, being able to find even ways during school holidays they can catch up with that group or catch up with that community or group of friends, so they still have that some sort of connection with it. I know when I went to boarding school in my last few years, my hometown created this initiative where they sent the local paper to all the kids at boarding school.
Oh, sweet.
So I didn't actually know a lot of the people in the paper at that point. I'd been away at boarding school for a few years, but it was just really good to, one, receive mail. Boarding school kids always love to receive mail. But also just to know what was going on and feel that connection to my community and that, you know, that part of me. So finding little things like that, you know, it's going to be unique for every child, of ways they can have that some sort of connection to whatever their connection to their community or group was.
Yep. And so just from that last little bit, so we use social media and phones a lot, but you said that, you know, boarding school kids enjoy getting mail. So would you recommend that could be something that parents do? Is that they send a care package or a letter or like that type of thing through the term to kind of keep that engagement and different things?
Yeah, absolutely. I assume kids still, I said that knowing that I loved receiving mail. I assume kids still like receiving mail. But, you know, there's nothing like getting a letter home from mum or dad and Mum used to send us Anzac bickies in the mail and that sort of thing. So those little things to help them feel part of the family and all those sorts of things. Very important to still do that.
Fantastic. So what's a final way that parents can prepare for their child going to boarding school?
So as I mentioned before, being mindful of how it's going to affect the whole family. And again, when I was talking to my parents about this webinar, that was their biggest takeaway. It'll be just as hard for the family as a child going away, and it affects everyone. So expect some behaviour change from, yourself, your partner, the siblings, getting used to the different family dynamics. So things parents can do is just be mindful of things like child sickness and behaviour change in your kids. It is going to probably happen to you. So just be prepared for that, and think of what advice you gave to your child to navigate homesickness. What can you do for you? Try to keep yourself busy and remember you have a life of your own and things you like to do. Try to stay connected with the school as well. So if there are teachers that you want to stay connected with, or the boarding house mum, or whoever it might be, just to know how your child's going and to try and stay involved. It's a lot trickier for boarding school parents to sort of know how kids are going in their subjects in the school compared to, just popping into the classroom in their hometown. So finding ways to try and stay involved as much as they can. Planning visits to your child, so at least once a term if you can. I know it's tricky for a lot of parents to try and have a weekend out of the boarding house and do something fun with the whole family. I know that was things that even when my brothers went to boarding school and I was still at home, but really looked forward to those weekends as a family out in Brisbane. And also connecting with other parents who have kids at boarding school, so trying to find that little bit of peer support from other parents, because they know what you're going through, they know what it's like. It's so tough for parents making that decision to put their children in boarding school, because it's a really hard thing for parents to go through. So being able to talk to other parents and families and know you're not alone can be really helpful. Even things like Facebook groups.
Okay. So just before we wrap up, we're running short of time here now. So what's the main thing parents should be aware of when they're preparing their children for boarding school?
So be mindful you're not just preparing those first few weeks. Your child's likely to be away for a few years, and it'll take a while for everyone to adjust to the new normal. Particularly if you have more than one child going away, it's likely your first child will adjust different to your second child or third and so forth, and that it will affect the whole family. And there's going to be good weeks and bad weeks. It can be quite unpredictable, so try and roll with it. You can't control everything, and think of those benefits that the whole family and the child's getting out of it as well. So the good with the bad, pretty much.
Yeah, good. And hopefully over time you'll see the benefits of sending your kids to boarding school, and they'll be able to go into different things, such as yourself, being a psychologist now and doing your PhD and all those type of fun things. So there's obviously benefits to staying at home and doing homeschool, and there's benefits to going away to boarding school. So hopefully everyone found this information you provided very insightful, and I know I've learned something from what you've talked about today. So if anyone wants to find out any more about this topic, then please feel free to go to our website at outbackfutures.org.au. But thank you so much, Margot, for sharing all of that fantastic content. And thank you for everyone who's joined us online. And we'll be in touch with you soon for more webinars. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nathan.